Have you ever held a piece of paper that was designed to destroy your entire life? Most people would crumble the moment they read the words. They would start shouting, begging, or pacing the room in a blind rage. But as I looked at the eviction notice Julian placed in front of me, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal or the urge to scream. I felt absolute icy clarity. It was like watching a clumsy thief trip over his own shoelaces while trying to escape. Julian sat across from me, in the private library of the Vines, the wedding venue I had spent the last 2 decades building from nothing. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit, and he had that specific, smug smirk on his face, the look of a man who truly believes he has won the game. He thought he was the smartest person in the room because he had managed to manipulate the legal system to his advantage. He didn't realize that in my world, possession is only 9/10 of the law. The other 10th belongs to the person who knows exactly where the bodies are buried, especially when those bodies are made of hidden offshore accounts and falsified signatures. I didn't reach for the paper immediately. I took my time. I studied the texture of the cardstock. It was heavy, cream-colored, and expensive. He had spent good money on the printing, clearly trying to make it look as official as possible to intimidate me. I looked at the notary seal at the bottom. It looked clean, a little too clean, almost like it had been applied yesterday rather than months ago when he claimed this deal was struck. I let the silence stretch out, filling the room. Silence is a powerful tool. Most people are terrified of it. They feel the need to fill the void with excuses, laughter, or nervous chatter. Julian, however, was enjoying the silence. He thought my silence was defeat. He thought I was finally broken, an old man who had lost his grip on his own legacy. He began to speak, his voice soft, dripping with the kind of fake, rehearsed empathy that only truly dangerous people possess. He talked about business realities and protecting the brand, acting as if he were doing me a massive favor by kicking me out of my own life. I just watched his eyes. I watched the way his pupils dilated when he thought he had me cornered. He was so arrogant that he didn't even notice I wasn't listening to his words. I was analyzing the pattern of his heartbeat in the vein of his neck. I am not a hot-headed person, and I never have been. I am a retired forensic accountant and corporate auditor. For 30 years, I didn't just work with numbers. I lived inside them. I spent my life dismantling complex shell companies, uncovering the fraud that hides in the fine print, and testifying in federal court against men who thought they were smarter than the law. While other people saw a spreadsheet, I saw a map. I saw the truth, hidden in the columns and the rows, waiting to be found. When you spend your career looking for lies, you start to see the world differently. You learn that people aren't usually smart. They are just greedy. And greed leaves a trail. Every transaction, every transfer, every fake signature leaves a digital footprint that cannot be erased. Julian didn't know this, of course. He viewed me as a simple father, a man distracted by his love for his daughter, Chloe, and his desire to retire. He saw a target. He saw an old man who was tired and ready to be pushed aside. He didn't see the man who used to tear apart multi-million-dollar corporations for breakfast. I remember when I first brought Julian into the business. He was charming, ambitious, and he had the perfect resume. He told me he wanted to learn from the best, and I, blinded by my desire to finally hand over the reins, believed him. I didn't run the deep-dive background check I would have run on any other employee. I treated him like family, which was the single biggest mistake of my life. I let him into my home. I introduced him to my daughter, and I gave him access to the books. I watched him work for months, thinking he was making the business grow. I was so busy looking at the beautiful flowers and the smiling couples that I didn't see the rot spreading underneath. I didn't see the unauthorized wires to accounts in the Cayman Islands. I didn't notice the small discrepancies in the vendor invoices. I was looking at the big picture, and he was counting the pennies he was stealing right out of my pocket. He was playing the long game, carefully preparing the ground to pull the rug out from under me. And now, sitting in this library, he thought the game was over. He thought the checkmate had been played. He had no idea that I had stopped playing his game a long time ago. He had walked into a trap, and he was going to spend the next few minutes cementing his own destruction, completely unaware of what was coming. It didn't start with a bang. That is the biggest lie people tell themselves about being betrayed. They think there is a moment, a loud signal, or a clear warning bell that goes off before someone sticks a knife in their back. But betrayal, especially the kind Julian orchestrated, is quiet. It is a slow, steady erosion of your world, hidden in plain sight. It started with the small things. A missing receipt here, a slight inconsistency in a catering invoice there. As a forensic auditor, I should have caught it. I spent decades training my eyes to find the discrepancy in a stack of thousands of documents. But I was blinded by the very thing I was trying to build for my daughter. I wanted a legacy. I wanted a comfortable retirement where I could watch Chloe get married and start her own family without worrying about the finances of the venue. Because I wanted it so badly, I ignored the cracks in the foundation. Julian was masterful at the art of the small lie. He would bring me a file to sign, and he would apologize profusely for a clerical error on one of the vendor contracts. He would smile, make a self-deprecating joke about how he was still learning the ropes, and I would laugh it off. We all make mistakes, right? That is what I told myself. I saw his ambition as a sign of dedication. I saw his long hours as a commitment to the business. I didn't see them as the hours he was using to slowly rewrite the ownership structure of my company. He was a professional actor, and I was the only audience member in the room, watching the performance with complete adoration. Then came the gaslighting. It was subtle, almost surgical. He would tell me that I had approved a transfer, or that I had discussed a deal with a vendor, when I knew for a fact that I hadn't. When I would correct him, he would pause, look at me with a mix of pity and worry, and suggest that I had simply forgotten. "You've been under a lot of stress, boss," he would say, his voice thick with fake concern. "Maybe you should step back a bit more. Let me take the weight off your shoulders." He planted seeds of doubt, not just in my mind, but in the minds of the staff. He started whispering to the venue managers that I was losing my edge, that my memory wasn't what it used to be. He was painting a picture of an old man who was slowly drifting away from reality, making himself look like the only stable hand on the ship. The most painful part of his plan was the way he used my daughter Chloe against me. He knew exactly what to say to her. He would tell her that I was being stubborn, that I was clinging to the business out of fear, and that I was hurting the venue's growth. He made her feel that I was the one standing in the way of her own success. He would stage little crises, a vendor threatening to pull out, a booking issue that didn't actually exist, and then he would save the day in front of her. He played the hero, and by comparison, I looked like the villain in my own story. That was how he got the power of attorney. He convinced Chloe that I was being reckless with the finances, that I was ignoring the modern trends, and that the only way to save the venue for our future was to give him the authority to make the big decisions. He did it with tears in his eyes, telling her how much he loved this place and how much he cared about our family. Chloe, who loves me but is young and trusts easily, was the one who pressured me to sign those papers. She begged me to trust him, to let him handle the stress so I could focus on her wedding. I looked at my daughter, saw the hope in her eyes, and I signed. I didn't see the trap closing around me. I didn't see that every page I signed was another brick in the wall he was building to shut me out. I look back at those weeks now, and I realize how calculated every move was. He wasn't just managing the venue, he was liquidating it. He was moving money into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, hiding the trail behind layers of shell companies that looked like legitimate business expenses on the surface. He was taking out loans against the venue's assets, pocketing the cash, and leaving the debt for me to deal with. He was bleeding the company dry, while smiling at the rehearsal dinners. He wanted to own everything, but he didn't want to build anything. He was a parasite, and he had found the perfect host. He thought he was untouchable because he had the legal documents in his hand. He thought he had won because he had convinced everyone around me that I was the problem. But he made one fatal error. He thought that because I was old, I was done. He didn't realize that a lifetime of hunting fraud doesn't just disappear because you turn 60. He was so busy celebrating his victory that he didn't realize he had left the one breadcrumb that would bring his whole house of cards crashing down. He had forgotten that I don't get angry when I'm lied to. I get focused. The moment Julian handed me that eviction notice, I didn't just walk out of that library. I walked into my own element. I drove home in total silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even call Chloe. My mind was already in motion, running through the steps of a procedure I had performed 1,000 times before. In the world of forensic accounting, you don't solve a crime by chasing the criminal. You solve it by chasing the money. Money is the only thing that doesn't lie. People lie. Signatures can be forged, and witnesses can be bought, but the trail of a digital transaction is absolute. It is a scar in the system that never heals. I walked into my home office and locked the door behind me. This room had been my sanctuary for years. It was filled with old textbooks, stacks of legal documents, and the hum of servers I kept running for my own peace of mind. I sat down at my desk and took a slow, steady breath. I didn't feel the panic Julian expected me to feel. I felt the familiar, cold comfort of a puzzle waiting to be solved. I booted up my primary workstation and waited for the screens to flicker to life. Julian was arrogant, but he was also lazy. That was his fatal flaw. He thought he had outsmarted me because he had access to the main account, but he didn't realize that I had built this business on a foundation of layers. I accessed the cloud server he thought he had secured. He had wiped the primary logs, sure, but he didn't know about the secondary, encrypted shadow ledger I had maintained since the day I hired him. I began to pull the data. I started with the last 6 months of transactions. It was a mess of disorganized entries and vague vendor names. To a normal person, it would have looked like business as usual. To me, it looked like a roadmap to a prison cell. I started sorting the data, highlighting the anomalies. I saw transfers that didn't match any invoices. I saw payments made to shell companies with names like Global Solutions Group and Napa Logistics, entities that didn't exist in any registry. I traced the wire transfers. Julian was moving money through a series of accounts in the Cayman Islands, hoping the distance and the lack of transparency would protect him. He was sloppy. He was so confident in his control over the business that he stopped trying to hide the scale of his theft. He thought he was untouchable because he had the legal papers, but those papers were the very thing that would hang him. I found the digital trail leading directly to his personal offshore accounts. Every single cent he had siphoned from my daughter's wedding venue was accounted for. I had the timestamps, the routing numbers, and the total amount. It was enough to bury him, but I needed more than just numbers. I needed to prove the intent. I turned my attention to the eviction notice he had given me. I scanned the document into my system and began a metadata analysis. This is where most criminals fail. They think a document is just the words on the page, but every digital file holds a ghost in its machine. I pulled the file properties. It showed the original creation date, the time it was edited, and, most importantly, the IP address where the changes were saved. The file had been created on a laptop that was registered to Julian's personal email. Even worse, the metadata showed it had been edited while he was supposedly on a business trip in Reno. He had lied about his whereabouts, and he had created the fraudulent document from a location that proved he was planning this takeover long before he claimed. I didn't stop there. I needed to verify the information with people who could make it official. I opened my encrypted messaging app and sent a brief, coded message to a former colleague at the SEC. I didn't need to explain the details. We had worked together for years. He knew my shorthand. I asked him to run a background check on the shell companies I had identified. Within 2 hours, I had the confirmation I needed. Those companies were already flagged for suspicious activity. They were part of a larger network of fraud that was currently under investigation. Julian hadn't just stolen from me. He had unwittingly tied his fate to a sinking ship. I spent the next 48 hours building the case. I put everything together in a single, comprehensive file. I cross-referenced the bank statements, the forged vendor invoices, the metadata from the eviction notice, and the evidence of the shell companies. It was a perfect, ironclad narrative of greed and deception. I didn't need a lawyer to see the truth. I had documented everything. I had the start, the middle, and the end of his little scheme. As I looked at the final report on my screen, I felt a deep sense of calm. The hunter was ready, and the prey had no idea he was already caught in the jaws of the trap he had helped build himself. Julian thought he was walking into the venue on the morning of the wedding to claim his prize, but he was actually walking into a dead end. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared at the screen. It was time to finalize the plan. The sun was high by the time I arrived at the venue on the morning of the wedding. The place was buzzing with activity. Florists were rushing around, the caterers were setting up, and the staff were running back and forth with clipboards. It was the kind of organized, high-stakes chaos that makes a venue come alive. And there, standing in the center of it all, was Julian. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that he had clearly charged to the business account, looking like he owned the world. He was doing a victory lap, greeting guests and shaking hands, playing the role of the benevolent owner perfectly. He looked like a man who had won everything. He didn't see me until I was standing 10 feet away, watching him with a stillness that didn't match the frantic energy of the room. When he did notice me, his face lit up with that familiar, predatory smirk. He walked toward me with purpose, probably intending to humiliate me in front of the staff. He wanted to make sure everyone knew that I was the past and he was the future. He didn't say hello. He just looked at me with a mix of boredom and annoyance. He gestured toward the door, clearly intending to remind me that I was no longer welcome at my own venue. It was a pathetic display, really. He was so caught up in the performance of power that he couldn't see the reality of his own position. He took a step closer, ready to say something cruel, something designed to make me feel small. I didn't give him the chance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply reached into the briefcase I had carried in with me and placed it on a side table. The leather made a soft thud against the mahogany. I opened it slowly, taking my time. Julian paused, his brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't know what I was doing. He thought I was here to beg for my job or argue about the eviction notice. He thought I was still playing the game he had set up. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. He told me to pack my things and leave before he called security. He told me that I was embarrassing myself and that no one here wanted me around. I didn't blink. I pulled out a thick, plastic-bound folder. I didn't say a word. I just slid it across the table toward him. I kept my hand on the cover for a moment, making sure he saw the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission on the front. I told him to look at the first page. He hesitated. For the first time, his confidence wavered. He picked up the folder, his fingers trembling just a fraction. He opened it, and as he read the first few lines, The smirk began to fade. It didn't happen all at once. It started in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, and then it spread to his mouth. The color drained from his face, until he was looking at me with the expression of a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door. I watched him read. It was beautiful, in a cynical, professional way. I watched his eyes scan the bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, and the metadata reports I had printed out. He looked at the amounts, the exact figures he had stolen, and then he looked back at me. He was trying to find a lie, an excuse, something to blame, but he couldn't. I had mapped out every single one of his movements. I had connected his shell companies to his personal accounts. I had built a bridge between his greed and his future prison sentence. "You thought you were evicting a tired old man, Julian," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying easily over the background noise. "You thought that because I didn't fight back, I was weak. But you didn't realize that in my line of work, we don't fight. We document." I leaned in closer, making sure every word hit home. "This file contains everything. The SEC has already been notified. The bank records are verified. The metadata from the eviction notice you wrote has been logged. You didn't just steal money, Julian. You created a roadmap for your own downfall. You handed me the evidence on a silver platter, and all I had to do was file the paperwork." His hands were shaking now. He tried to speak, to stammer out a protest, but the words wouldn't come. The arrogance that had defined him just moments ago was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. He looked around the room, hoping for an exit, but he was trapped in the center of the wedding he had ruined. He was the owner of nothing, and the architect of his own destruction. It was the most satisfying moment of my career. The game was over, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. I could see the realization sinking in. He wasn't the one evicting me. I was the one evicting him from his life of freedom. Julian didn't walk out quietly. People like that never do. When the reality of his situation finally settled in, he didn't just surrender. He tried to thrash around, hoping to break the cage he had built for himself. He turned to the wedding planner, his voice cracking with a frantic, desperate energy, and tried to spin a story about how I was a bitter, confused old man trying to ruin a beautiful day. He pointed at the file, calling it a forgery, a setup, a lie, but his performance was hollow. He was shaking, and his eyes were darting around the room, looking for a way out that didn't exist. The guests had stopped talking. The music, which had been playing softly in the background, seemed to fade into a dull, uncomfortable hum. Everyone could feel that the air in the room had changed. The confidence he had radiated just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind only the naked, sweating truth of a cornered animal. I didn't raise my voice to counter him. I didn't need to. I simply signaled to the security staff I had hired, not to protect the venue from guests, but to ensure that Julian couldn't leave before the authorities arrived. I stood there, arms folded, watching him disintegrate. It was a fascinating study in human nature. When someone relies on deceit to build their entire existence, they have no foundation when that deceit is removed. They don't know how to stand on their own. Julian tried to approach my daughter, Chloe, pulling her aside to whisper lies, his face twisted in a mask of manufactured panic. He grabbed her arm, trying to force her to see him as the victim. But I stepped in. I didn't push him. I simply stood between them. I looked at him with the same detached observation I would use for a failing financial audit. I told him, "The authorities are already on their way, Julian. The SEC doesn't care about your excuses, and frankly, neither do I." The moment Chloe saw the documents in the folder, the proof of the wire transfers, the evidence of the shell companies, the confusion in her face turned into a cold, hard realization. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at Julian, really looked at him, for the first time. She saw the man who had been whispering in her ear for months, the man who had turned her against her own father, and she finally saw the predator behind the mask. She pulled her arm away from him as if he were burning her. That was the real victory. It wasn't about the money, or the venue, or the pride. It was about the truth. The lies he had told about me were dismantled in seconds, not by a long emotional argument, but by the undeniable weight of facts. He was escorted out by the police 10 minutes later. He went quietly then, his head bowed, his expensive suit rumpled, looking like exactly what he was, a thief who had gotten too comfortable. In the weeks that followed, the legal process was almost mechanical. The trail I had uncovered was so clear, so perfectly documented, that there was no room for a defense. Julian had left a breadcrumb trail that led straight to his cell. He was charged with financial fraud, money laundering, and grand theft. The venue was cleared of the liens he had placed on it, and the shell companies were dissolved by the government. The business went back to being what it was always meant to be, a place for people to celebrate their beginnings, not a place for someone to hide their end. Chloe and I spent a long time cleaning up the mess he left behind. We had honest conversations about trust, about ambition, and about the difference between looking for a shortcut and building a life. She learned a hard lesson that day, but she learned it well. She became a better business owner because of it, and we grew closer in the rubble than we ever were before. There is a final, cynical truth about revenge that most people misunderstand. They think it's about getting even or causing someone else as much pain as you felt. They think it's about fire and fury and public destruction. But that kind of revenge is sloppy. It's emotional. It leaves you just as ruined as the person you're trying to destroy. Real revenge isn't about the other person at all. It's about the truth. It's about being so prepared, so calm, and so observant that the people who try to betray you end up handing you the evidence for their own defeat. In life, you are going to meet a lot of people like Julian. They are the ones who smile at your face while they sharpen the knife behind their back. They are the ones who think that because you are kind, you are weak. They are the ones who assume that because you are quiet, you aren't paying attention. And they will always make the same mistake. They will underestimate the value of the details. They will think they are playing a game of power when they are actually playing a game of patience. Never let them see you lose your composure. Let them think they have the upper hand. Let them build their castle of lies as high as they want, because the higher they build it, the harder it crashes when you pull out the foundation. Stay calm. Keep your records, and always remember that no matter how smart they think they are never as smart as the person who is simply watching, waiting, and waiting for the right moment to speak the truth. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be heard. And when it is the only thing that stands.